Mick, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, by all means. I mean, ostensibly now I'm retired. That's my official title, I think. But some years back, many years back now, I used to be a teacher. I taught for just under 20 years in secondary school and sixth form. And then I left to be an advisory teacher in a local education authority. And it was just after that, then I went back into school and did about another 12 months or so. And then I got a job with I think called the National Curriculum Council, which had been set up by the 1988 Education Reform Act to bring in a national curriculum, which we have in our English schools. So I went away to work on the national curriculum. It was never meant to be a long-term job. It was meant to be, write the thing and then presumably go back into teaching, but that never quite happened. So I stayed with the National Curriculum Council for many years, and it went through various iterations from the National Curriculum Council to the Schools Curriculum Assessment Authority, and its whole thing evolved from being a curriculum council with a separate assessment council down in London. We were based in York, but when we formed the School Curriculum Assessment Authority, the two came together. And at that point, it was quite useful for me because I'd been an examiner for GCSE and CSE before that. So I gradually moved from curriculum more into the assessment field. So I worked on various things in assessment, from validating syllabuses for A-level GCSEs, that kind of thing. And ultimately finished up, I was responsible for monitoring all the awarding bodies in England, both vocational and academic, of which was about 147, I think it was in my time. So not just the GCSE and A-level, but vocational and occupational awarding bodies in that. And then I was executive director of the QCDA in my final post, where I was responsible for both curriculum and the assessment. But most of the assessment then had gone off into Ofqual. We set up Ofqual in 2009. So what remained in QCDA was the National Curriculum Assessments, SATs as people refer to them. So I was accountable for the SATs and the curriculum up to retiring. And since retiring, I've been wandering up and down the system, doing various things. I still work with the DFE to some degree and meet ministers. I've worked with governments abroad as well as in their own nations. I'm currently president of the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors, which takes up quite a fair bit of my time. That's all voluntary stuff. I'm a trustee of a school, the governor of another school, and still involve myself in all manner of assessment things. And it's probably the last thing I'd say is at the University of Leeds, I was recently given the role of research fellow in the pedagogic policy and curriculum group. So that's where I am today, but still I haven't given up on it. It's still in the blood, I think. It's hard to get away from.
Tell us a little bit about your research that you did for your doctorate.
Yeah, well, the doctorate's quite interesting. I think it's interesting. Other people who read it may not find it so. But I actually started that in something like 1989. I finished a master's at the University of Leeds, and for some strange reason they invited me back. I had a phone call from one of the tutors, a very strange phone call, about 6 months after I'd left. And I always remember it because when I answered the phone, the voice at the other end said, "Are you happily married?" Which was kind of a strange phone call that you'd normally hang up these days. When I said, "Who is this?" the voice at the other end said, "Never mind who it is, just answer the question." So I said, "Well, yeah, I think I." But in a kind of sense of panic, my wife was stood next to me. I said, "My wife, if you like to ask her, she can validate that or invalidate what I've just said." I said, "Well, but who is this?" And then he said, "It's John." I won't use his second name, but he was one of the senior lecturers here. He said, I've rung up to say I think you ought to do a PhD. And the reason I'm asking about your marital status is the last 3 people I've advised to do a PhD, the managers have all broken up. So he said, I'm really nervous about encouraging people to do it. But I started doing it, and it was very much I wanted to do something around educational assessment. And at that time, very much around what awarding exam boards were doing in the mainstream. And by that I mean general qualifications, A-levels and GCSEs. But it was quite a problem to find tutors in the School of Education, and not just at Leeds. There were other places as well, because people didn't kind of specialise in in assessment, even though we've got examiners and all these awarding bodies. And I'll come on to that later probably, but the qualifications and the expertise in assessment is quite thin, even to this day, and again we'll no doubt pick up on that at some point. So finding a tutor was problematic. But just after we found a couple of tutors, I got the job, as I mentioned earlier, at the National Curriculum Council. So I asked, could we just put it on hold until I got into the rhythm of working in York, living in Huddersfield, working in York, because I wanted to make sure that was bedded in before doing a part-time PhD. It stayed suspended until I retired in 2011. So as you know, I did it a few years after that. So it's always been a burning ambition to do something around assessment. And oddly enough, much of what I found in 88, 89 around that time hadn't changed an awful lot. So I still wanted to look about things around the competency, about the fairness and what the future of assessment, particularly around teacher assessment. Because that's the bit I was really, really interested in, about how we prepare teachers in mainstream schools and other places, how we recognise them, how we train them, etc., and how we look at their ongoing development. So the focus was very much around that. And the big question that came out of it for me, and where the focus became, was around trust. Trust in the profession to do these things. Because as you'll know, over years we've had coursework and controlled assignments and all manner of things. But more recently there's been a move away from that for things to be external. And a lot of that is around the reliability and the trust in teacher assessment. And I subscribe to that. I mean, working in policies I believe there is an issue around there, because we don't train people, we don't have proper systems in place to standardise and moderate, etc. So the focus is very much around trust and how that's moved over the years, because it hasn't been static. I covered the period, roughly 1944, 43, up to the present day, and there's definitely been trends and differences. I use Michel Foucault's approach, the philosopher Foucault's approach to epistemes, as he called them, different periods, and looking how different periods created different attitudes, if you like, to assessment and different feelings of trust, particularly around teacher assessment.
Very interesting. So, as an expert in assessment, I would love to ask you the fundamental question of what is assessment?
That's a really good question, and I tend to use. I started to differentiate by talking about educational assessment, because I think when we talk about assessment, there's all sorts of things go out in society, like risk assessment, for example, tax assessment, all these kind of things. So in my field, the bit I'm interested in, I think we are talking about today is educational assessment. So first of all, I'd posit it in that arena. So it's very much about educational assessment, and then to dig deeper in that, what it's about is trying to, in essence, it's really trying to gauge students' learning, if you like, students' knowledge, understanding of what we've taught them within the education system. What we do with that and how we do that is very varied and very, very complex. But in essence, education assessment is about measuring learning. What we then do with it, how well we do that, is a different question. So it really is very much around the learning process, which then should inform the teaching process. So we've got this cycle. So within the pedagogical framework, I mean, how do we know we've taught unless we've done some assessment? Basically, we can all rock up in front of a class and talk for 40 minutes and then walk out again. But how do we know if anything has stuck? Have there been any misconceptions? Have we come across with the right things? Have we emphasised the right things to students? And I found from my early days that much of my involvement in assessment as a teacher was more about me than the students. I was more alarmed by what the students were playing back to me, and starting to think, hang on, where did they get some of these mad ideas or some of the misconceptions? And you start to play back in your own mind about that lesson or those lessons. So for me, it was not so much about what the students knew, because often they'd learn whatever I'd thrown at them. But sometimes I hadn't thrown it at them in the right way, if that makes sense. I hadn't kind of delved into the right things. And some of the misconceptions were down to me rather than to their intellect. So it is very much for me around that process of the education process and measuring where learning has taken place, and then making decisions on the back of that, inferences on the back of that, and doing something with it, which can range from giving a qualification through to modifying your next lesson. There's a whole gambit of things in that.
What's the main purpose of assessment then for you?
It depends where I am. There's some interesting work by Paul Newton, who I used to work with at QCA. He's now a professor at UCL and works at Cambridge and all over the place. Very, very bright individual. But Paul identified 22 uses of assessment. And I think that's where I always start from. I think Paul and I used to have debates. I think I came up with another couple, so there might be 24. Don't ask me to repeat them all. But there's something like 22 to 24 purposes. And they do range from things like, as people call them, diagnostic or formative or summative, right to practice, to get a driving license, to if you're an athlete, what we call ipsative assessment, this whole notion of your personal best, measuring myself, did I run this faster, or am I on the right track, no pun intended in terms of athletics, about, to get to a particular point. So it really depends on, what field that you're working in. Because I don't have any issue at all with it being about a qualification, to rank people, providing we're clear that's what it's about. And the assessment instrument is designed to do that. But equally, where I do get, what it does cause me problems is when people use a test instrument and then try to do lots of other things with it that it wasn't designed for. And this is where Paul Newton's work came in. Because he was looking at things like, the GCSE, take the humble GCSE, which goes back to the early 50s, which really was a method of, it was designed as a kind of selection, a selection approach to pick out young folk to go on to do A level, who would then go on to do degrees, to go into university. So it was aimed at about 5-6% of the population. But you look at the history of that over time, and it spread. People started to work out, hang on a minute, it has currency. So more people started doing it. And then you look to, come right up to date, and you've got governments from 1992 onwards, when performance tables were introduced, measuring schools or measuring the system. Now, the GCSE was never designed to do that. And you'll get people like Gordon Stobart, who was written again, he's, I think, emeritus professor at Oxford now. Gordon, another chap I worked with, who talks about the uses and abuses of assessment. And I think that's, a kind of key area that people really need to think about. So, what it is that you're trying to assess is absolutely crucial to me in designing how you do it. Because I think, people don't think hard enough about what is it I'm trying to measure here. And then ask yourself, why? Why am I doing that? What's the purpose of doing that? Then you can start to work out how best to do it. And sometimes it is a written exam in a hall, for 3 hours or whatever. But sometimes, that's, if it's about flying an aeroplane, I don't want someone to pass a paper-based test. I'd like to know they've actually done this thing for real before they invite me on board as a passenger. So I think purpose really is key for me before start to say what it is. And it can be used, teachers use it. You are doing it now. Minute by minute, we're constantly assessing our environment. And if it's in the educational setting in a classroom, teachers are constantly assessing. They're looking around the classroom, but the 30 kids sat there to see, in my case, who's nodded off, who was looking out the window. So there's this kind of constant thing. And then, you'll do the cold calling question or whatever they call it, just to check has something gone in. And if you've a bit of wit about you and dig deeper into that, rather than just did everyone understand it and everyone says yes and you move on. So that, this kind of formative so-called approach that's done incredibly badly. And I'm happy to talk about that and justify that should you wish. But it can be within that classroom situation just an ongoing check. Is this making sense to the students? Whereas at the other end, it can be, at the end of a course, what have people got from that? Because that then becomes a gatekeeper to the next bit, a bit like license to practice in effect. So being clear about the purpose is always the starting point for me. Why are you doing this? And that can be a high-stakes exam. It can be something that happens in a classroom. It can be an end-of-term test, whatever it is. But first thing is, why are you doing this? What is it you're wanting to know?
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this in a moment. But before that, what do you see as the biggest myth or misconception in assessment?
Probably that it's accurate, I would guess. Some people swear about. Like, I mean, I've just said a few minutes ago that it's a license to practice. Once you pass that driving test, people let you out. They let you loose on the road. I mean, you could have fluked that test. You could, it might have all just worked nicely on the day. And I think some people, the way people use data, for example, is again going back to the performance tables, and people talk about value added. And I go around schools where they talk about, this child's made 0.01% progress this term. This is insane. And when you look at what that's based on, it's on shifting sands. So there's a kind of belief by a lot of people that assessment is, it's infallible. It's right. If you've got a C, it's a C. If you've got an A, it's an A, or whatever it might be. When really underneath, it really is. It's riddled with challenges to get it right. So really, any assessment is a kind of a proxy for performance. We never get what they call the true score. The true score being if everything is in alignment. It really is the best of that student's understanding. It really, the question has been set properly. It's been marked accurately. They're relaying accurately what they've been taught, etc. But as you know, that doesn't happen very often. As you wake up on a morning before an exam with a headache, or a number of times you come out of an exam thinking, God, I forgot to say this, I should have said that, or I wrote that wrong, or whatever. Or the questions that were set were poorly set, or then someone hasn't marked it accurately. So I think the biggest thing is that it is a hard and fast science. It's not. It's not foolproof, and I think we have to understand that and make limits for that. And even down to the point, just to illustrate that. I remember some time ago at a conference, this was the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors conference, where a couple of academics standing up talking about the GCSE and A level, and basically saying what I've just said. It isn't so precise that a 45 becomes a C one year and it's a 46 the next, and so many moving parts and what have you. So what they were suggesting was that we ought to give confidence intervals on all our examination results. So, when you take that to the nth degree, that would probably mean that, you've got a 2-1 if it's in a university, plus or minus a classification, or you've got a GCSE grade 6, plus or minus a grade. So my question today was, how does that work in society then? When I rock up for a job, and I show my GCSE certificates to somebody, it's kind of plus or minus a grade. How will you interpret that?
Right.
So my suggestion to them was, well, you lead the way. You go back to your universities tomorrow, and you go first. You start awarding your degrees plus or minus, and if that works, we'll follow suit. At which point they both decided it might not be the best way forward. But it does kind of illustrate the kind of level of confidence that we've got in any assessment. But again, be it in the classroom or be it high stakes, there's always that chance, a good chance. It's not 100% accurate.
So, given the impact on workload for teachers, and also the limitations that you've just mentioned, and the potential impact on people's lives, should we actually bother with it?
That's a good question. I think we have to bother with it because we want to know, is our teaching, right down at the bottom, is our teaching effective? And I think society is now in a place where we do want to measure whether people can do X, Y, or Z in order to help the selection to the next bit. That's the general thing. If you look at most qualifications, that's their purpose really. It is to sift out. It is to put people in a rank order so that people can then say, if you've got a C or above, that means something to them. What that means is debatable. It often fascinates me that when we talk about a good GCSE being a grade 4 above nowadays, and people all kind of nod along with that. Or they'll talk about, this child, there's evidence here that this child is a fluent reader, and everyone says, oh, good. But what does that mean? What sits underneath that C or that phrase? So I think we do need assessment. I mean, if you're teaching, you need to know, have you been effective? forget the student for a minute. Have I done what I'm supposed to do? Have I imparted this knowledge? Have I opened their thinking? Have I opened doors? Whatever. So I want to know that as a teacher all the time. Otherwise, I might as well just say, give them a load of books to go and read and toddle off, and we never meet again. Or I just rock up and lecture, and then walk out of the room and we call it quits. And I think Dylan Williams said something like, if students learned everything we told them, then we wouldn't need assessment. And I think that kind of sums up the kind of response to that question, really, that if we could just, guarantee that I stand up and I lecture or I can teach or whatever, and every kid in that class gets it word for word, then I wouldn't need to assess. But that isn't how life works. So I need to know as a teacher for my next lesson, are they ready to move on to the next bit? If it's a qualification to drive a car, then I need to know, can they do these, have they got these various competencies? So I think, yes, we do need assessment. And I think if you took it away as a formal thing, people would still do it. I think it's a natural thing. People do assess. Even, we were talking before we started this in the sports arena that, when you pick a side, you tend to pick a side on various things. You've done some kind of assessment, or if it's athletics, then if you're picking your Olympic team, assessment is used there in terms of what speeds people have run at over that last 12 months, or what the batting average is of somebody. All these things are used, so they're all kind of assessment issues. But I just think the problem with assessment and where it gets a bad name, and you mentioned workload, is when it's not properly understood, therefore it's not administered and used correctly. And then we get issues with it. Simple things like people getting the wrong classification, having to be remarked, etc. That's a kind of a common thing where people get up in arms. But for me, that's part of the process. I remember when I used to run the regulation of awarding bodies, that teachers used to get up in arms about the fact they'd had to write in and ask for a remark. Because they found that, in their view, it was wrong, and then the grade was changed. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does, and then that underlines the trust in the system, and then the teachers will call whatever. But my view was, well, no, that's the final check in effect. That's part of the system. It's not trying to catch anyone out. It's just a facility for someone to say, this doesn't seem right. Can you just check it? So it's not an add-on. But I think when you mentioned the workload, and I think this is why, or where, one of the reasons assessment gets such if I can call it a bad press, for want of a better phrase, why it's seen as a kind of the work of the devil. Besides this thing about, ranking children, some people don't like children to be ranked, which I get, but again, that should come back to the purpose. But again, visiting schools, the amount of stuff I see people do under the heading of assessment is kind of mad. And I was involved in working for the DFE on the workload, the workload commission, where we were looking at, particularly around assessment and use of data in schools. And you look at some of the stuff that goes on in schools, you can see why people are getting snowed under by what they call workload. Most of it created by themselves. Why are they setting all these homeworks? Why do they set them in a particular way? Why do they have all these so-called data drops where they gather all these data together, much of which is not valid in the first place? But then they'll crunch it, mess around with it, get into a nice pie chart or a bar graph, and then they'll work out kids have made 0.01% of progress, whatever that means, and they're all happy about it. But to me, the underlying stuff is, if it's done properly, you don't need that amount of work that goes into it. So I think much of it goes back to the misunderstanding of assessment. People do some mad things in schools that they don't really need to do, but it's almost become part of the culture. And I can give you an example of,
please do
that. When we were on the workload group, I did the research for they brought this committee together. And I was asked to do the initial research about a thing called triple marking, which was a thing that kind of driven this whole idea for having a workload group around marking. And triple marking, for colleagues who are not aware of it, is where the teacher sets some work or whatever, and then the teacher marks it with his or her red pen, and then the student responds in a green pen, and then the teacher responds to the green pen in a purple pen. And it goes on like that until they either run out of pens or colours, or somebody loses the will to live. And what we couldn't work out was where does that come from? So I did the research on that. There's no empirical research anywhere to talk about that as an approach that is effective. And I think that's something that's really worth mentioning to folk. Whatever assessment you do in your school, your workplace, or whatever, every now and again check, is it having the desired effect? People don't do that. We just get into the habit. We have an exam at the end of every term. So the only place I could find any reference to that triple marking approach, and it was called All Things when he went round school looking at school websites, from CSI, Deep Forensic Marking, one school called it. It was CSI was some kind of series that was on TV at the time, Spooks or Spies or whatever. They were trying to make it a little bit sexy, I think, by calling it CSI Forensic Marking. But you've got teachers, spending hours and hours doing this thing. The only bit of evidence I could find, it was a school in Marylebone in London. I won't mention the school, but it was in Marylebone. And it was on the Ofsted website as a feature of gut practice. And what this school had done, they were using this system of green pen, brown pen, whatever it was. And it'd been put on as gut practice. And once Ofsted put that up as gut practice, as we all know, schools think, we better do that, so that when we're inspected. And it had spread like wildfire. Again, the other bit of evidence I found at the time was I think no one quite understands how blue tits learn to take the tops off milk bottles. Now that might sound a little bit of an odd leap, but what it was how do these things spread? Because all of a sudden in the papers, sometime in the 50s or 60s, there was lots of things in the news about people complaining that their milk, the blue tits, had taken the top off the milk and started drinking the milk. And nobody could quite understand how come it was happening in the north of England and the southwest of England at the same time. How do these things spread? How do they get back? Do the blue tits meet at the end of every day and pass it on to the next garden? But something had worked within education to pass on these things. And we do have fads and different approaches that keep cropping up and then disappear, then in my experience come back again. So I raised this. Sean Harford, who was Director of Policy at the time, was part of this group. And when I finished my presentation at 11 o'clock when we broke for coffee, Sean immediately shot out of the room. Because I noticed him shooting out. And he came back in with about 10 minutes, came straight up to him and he just said, "That's been taken down." I said, "What's that case today?" He said, "I didn't know it was there. It's now gone. We've had it removed." But I think it's these things of, if I call them fads or ideas, that sometimes they're meant, they're meant for the benefit of students and teachers. And I'm sure that school in Marylebone, it probably worked for them because they devised it, thought it was a good idea. They probably managed the workload implications. But when it spreads, people start doing these things without understanding the underlying things. And I think that's when we start to see kind of bad practice in assessment.
Do you see if there are any kind of underlying issues which are leading to this kind of behaviour, for it to spread so quick? I'm guessing, or I'm assuming, that there might be some kind of assumptions or incentives or whatever it is that people are kind of thinking this way of practice is going to help them in some way. What do you see as, if there are any underlying issues that's causing this?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I don't think anyone, wherever I've seen what I would call, poor practice or bad practice, it's never been done maliciously. Teachers are not like that in my experience. They tend to be doing things for what they see as the best reason. So I don't think any of this kind of bad practice I've seen has been driven by a kind of malicious intent or anything. But I think it is part of the culture of teaching, and it goes back, as we know, many, many years about, you get an exam. You do exams, this at the end of the term. When I was at school, they tend to be, you didn't get much in between, an end of year and year on year stuff, whereas now there seems to be more pressure. And I think some of that pressure is because of cultural changes. I think key to that are things like, what was it in 1976, 77, Callaghan's Ruskin College speech when he talks about the secret garden of teaching. And I think up to that time, I think it was a reasonable analysis. The profession just kind of got on with it. You went into your classroom, you did your thing, and nobody really questioned it much. And nobody kind of question what happens when children move from one school to the other, in a sense. And they still don't. I'd like to come back to that if we can, about how we design curricula and link it to assessment from the ages of 4 through to 18 or 19 or beyond. But it was down to teachers to do things the way that they'd always been done. When they were at school, they'd always had tests or exams at the end of the year. So you just kind of replicate that. And then, as we know, there was CSEs, GCSEs, and lots of other things we've had in between, CPV, Certificate of Pre-Vocational Education, BTECs, GMVQ Part 1s. There's been lots of different approaches. But I think what concerns me is that despite the so-called it is important assessment because of its impact, we've never really trained our teachers properly in the basics. This is part of my thesis, really, going back to the PhD, that we don't trust them because basically we don't train them. And I think it was 2015, the Carter Review of Initial Teacher Training. One of the key finding was that the weakest part of initial teacher education or training was around assessment. And there was, again, from my research, there was a lot of support to say, to support that. So about 80% of respondents to surveys I did agreed with that. But perhaps more worrying, about the same percentage agreed that there wasn't expertise either in schools or in initial teacher training institutions. Because in effect, we've got people in ITT who've come from the classroom, in effect, and probably been really good practitioners, and then replicate whatever it is. But they themselves haven't had that kind of grounding. And again, that was why we set up the Chartered Institute of Education Assessors in 2000, from 2002 it started to fall. Because at that time there was what they called the A-level fiasco. There was again public outcry about results, and that's an interesting aside. Around that time we had an international panel looking at the way that we regulated our qualifications in this country, and it was quite a good report. But one of the things that struck them, Barry McGaw was head of education at the OECD, Eva Baker was professor of education at UCLA, and then Stuart Sutherland, who was a former HMI and at that point provost of Edinburgh University. They were the panel. And the thing that struck them, particularly two people from OECD, Barry was from Australia, still is from Australia, and Eva from America, was what they call this jamboree every summer. It's headlines every summer in the papers about results have gone up or they've gone down, or A-levels have got too easy or too hard. And you can never win, which, every year, if more kids pass the A-level, which I remember Eva Baker saying, well, that's what you want, basically. You want more people to pass. So she could never understand why, if more people did pass or get better grades, all the papers are up in arms saying it's got too easy. So you can't win on that. But I think because of the habits that are within, and this whole notion of how do we train people to assess, when it got to 2002, with all the stuff in the papers, we were looking at examiners who worked for all the awarding bodies. This was A-level initially. But one of the things that came around from that was when you look at it, none of them had a qualification in assessment. They'd been doing it for some years, either as a teacher, and then they'd got a job as a marker, and from that they'd get onto a committee and start designing papers, and then they'd be a moderator or something. So they kind of learn, it's like an apprentice almost, picking up on the job and gradually rolling into it, but no formal qualification. And you learn to do it in the way that particular awarding body did it. They're all pretty similar, to be fair, but they have slightly idiosyncratic approaches. So you'd learn in that way. So what we started to think about was, we don't train our people properly to do this in a way that they could move between awarding bodies. And then we started to say, well, if we did that, besides the awarding bodies benefiting, then schools would benefit. Because all these people, 90% of them are teachers, despite what some of the newspapers were saying at the time. So they go back into schools. And my view is that if they're better qualified in assessment, that will benefit their school when they go back in to the school. But we didn't have a system for doing that even. When I was chief examiner, if anything in the staff room, any discussion cropped up about assessment, the first thing you did as a chief examiner was hide, because you'd know that within minutes you'd be getting some flack from your colleagues about the quality of marking or something. And it was a surprise to me. I went to an examiners meeting across different subjects in the Yorkshire Humberside board. To my surprise, 2 colleagues from my school, one for music and one for history, were chief examiners. I didn't know that. They didn't know I was a chief examiner. And we would, it's a surprise to us. And again, the discussion was the reason we didn't spread it was you kind of keep your head down a little bit. That's totally opposite to what it should be. We should be going back into school and saying this is how it works. This is how we can learn from this. Or all that stuff, but we don't. So when we looked at 2002, that gap was clear. There was a lack of a voice. So there's no representation, no body, if you like, for examiners to discuss things. And by voice, we were very clear. We meant about professional dialogue. That's one of the things that the exam boards were rightly concerned about at the time, that if we did form an institute, they were frightened it would very quickly become a union, and then it would be about pay and conditions and examiners striking and that kind of thing. So we made it absolutely crystal clear, and the institute got its Royal Charter in 2007. One of the clear things around this is there's no political connections whatsoever. What we're interested in is improving education assessment wherever it takes place. So we're not bothered about whether someone gets 3 pence more in this award rather than the other or whatever it is. Important that might be, but not for us. But I think the other thing that happened around that time was, as I say, it started with the A level. And within minutes, really, because some of us have been banging on about this for some time, you start to work out, well, it's not just A levels. People do work on GCSEs, the National Curriculum Assessments, vocational qualifications. So we kind of spread it from that. And if you look at the CIA now, its membership has got people from a lot of teachers, but people from universities, from the armed forces, the Royal College of Surgeons, for example, put all their examiners as members through that, because we're all tackling with the same issues. Slightly different context, but same issue. It's about validity, reliability, whatever it is, and applicability, the workload. But we can learn so much from each other. So that voice is so important. It's a voice that's not kind of a top-down. It's kind of working across. And going back to saying with Carter, if we could get that more into initial teacher education and make that more, a deeper understanding, then I think we could improve what happens in schools, not just workload, but in terms of improving the quality of teaching and learning.
Right. But I was just thinking about, what you're saying in terms of things that are obviously happening to help address the issue or issues of there not being expertise, regarding assessment. How do you scale it up from what you're doing so that, it can really be disseminated in terms of what makes effective assessment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one of the challenges for the CIA in terms of its role, because it is a charitable body, so it doesn't have, massive funds, although it was sponsored by the government when it was first set up, because it was a reaction to a kind of a political issue, I guess, at the time. So it did get that backing. But scaling that up is problematic. I mean, for me, if we talk about education within, compulsory education, schooling, I'd rather call it schooling rather than education. This education does go on beyond the classroom, and I think we need to differentiate more. Language needs to be a bit more precise to differentiate schooling from education. But within schooling, I really think, following what Carter said, to be honest, that if we could improve the input in initial teacher education as to what assessment is about, and I fully appreciate colleagues in ITT when I've spoken to one or two, well, more than one or two of them. If you put a lot more on assessment, then something else gets squeezed out, which they're under pressure to cover whatever it is. And then with the recent marketisation of assessment, the recent government push to get this, I think, a push to remove it from universities, to get it more in, into trust, into the classroom, etc., which to some degree I get. But the downside of that is that, and again, I've seen this talking to some youngish or new teachers, that what they get is whatever that school understands by saying, this is how we do it, and then they just mirror that. I think the advantage of initial teacher education institutions is that they would have a more holistic, a broader view of that. And I think what they should do, this is not that I can tell them to do that, is not to separate it out, because assessment was a kind of a unit or something, or a module. And I do remember at QCA, they used to invite us to speak to lots of places. They because, well, mainly because we were cheap, really, we didn't charge. Not because we were particularly interesting, certainly not in my case. But they often wanted us to go and talk about, what was happening with the national curriculum, or what was happening with GCSE reform, whichever one we were up to at that point. But I do remember going to one institution, which I won't name, where I was met at the Porter's Lodge by a chap who said he'd been told to look out for me. He was going to take me to the lecture theatre and set, the overhead projector up, or whatever it was at the time, the slides and what have you, because the course leader was actually teaching a module just before that. And he said he was at great pains to point out that I shouldn't be worried. I think it was due to start at 11 o'clock. He says, if there are no students in the hall at 3 minutes to 11, please do not worry. He said at 2 minutes to 11, that door at the back, so it was a big lecture theatre, about 600 of these students. The door will fly off the hinges. It will fill up rapidly. And he said, equally, please don't be embarrassed if at 2 minutes to 12 or 3 minutes to 12, they all stand up and walk out, because they've got to go to the next module. So I said, that's fine. I'm used to people walking out of my stuff. That's not an issue. Anyway, I did the presentation. And when I finished, this woman who sat at the front, who I hadn't met before, just stood up and said, introduced herself as the Dean of whatever. And she said, can I thank you for the presentation, which, she's very kind about it. And then she turned to the students and said, right, off you go to your next module. So as forecast, sort of shoot, they all disappeared. And then she turned around to me and said, thank you very much. I can now tick off the assessment module. And that's at that minute stuck with it, that bit. I said, I know you're in a terrible rush, but could you what do you mean, the assessment module? She said, oh, you've just done the assessment module. And I thought, no, I haven't. I was talking about, some reforms. I did talk about things that were relative to assessment, like something we were doing with the GCSE at the time, whatever it was. But it wasn't about assessment. And then from there, I must have spoken to a dozen different initial teacher education institutions, and it was more or less the same thing was going on. They were saying that's the assessment model. So no, I think we've got to get more bang for a buck. I think to get to some of the younger, new teachers, new to the profession, and give them the tools, and then it becomes to go. Sorry, I need to go back to your question. Is how do we then sustain that? So this continuous professional development, and I know that there are masses of challenges in that about continuing to train people to keep up to speed, but we've got to find a way of doing that. And if it's a profession, then we've got to find a way of doing that. I'd hate to think that my doctors were still using leeches or whatever. I want to know they were moving on with the science, with the knowledge that we were accumulating, and also the kind of repartee that I think teachers need. That if you find out how to do it in one school, it might be quite good actually. I'm not saying there isn't good practice out there. And you might learn that good practice, but it may or may not work in the next institution you move to. So this kind of, having a repertoire for me is that teachers have because they've got the deep understanding, the knowledge, they can flex it a little bit to meet the new context of this particular school or this particular institution. So I think we need to do much more in terms of how we train and continuously develop our teachers in assessment, and not as an add-on. This is not telling them what's the latest development in BTECs or GCSEs or whatever. It's about the underlying principles, and I think that way we would reduce workload, because we'd stop people doing a lot of math things in schools that they feel obliged to do. Or it's just a habit. In fact, there's a report we wrote. It's available on the DFE website with the WOWS school in Wigan, with others we succeed. We looked at workload, and the first session we had with 17 schools from Wigan was this kind of loose association. They're not a trust, or they're not set up by the local authority. They've just over the years worked together, and they're a fantastic group. And myself and Tim Oates, who chaired the last review of the national curriculum, and a lad called Graham Herbert, who was a former chief exec of the CIA, we worked with them to look at assessment and workload in the schools, particularly around the marking stuff. And I do remember the first session where we kind of asked them to talk about to each other really about their approach to marking. And one of the key questions when they explained it was, why do you do it like that way? And that was the first kind of tripwire that we came across, because none of them really knew. And they were, in a lovely way, I mean, these are really nice folk who were very open, used to speaking to each other, which I think helps, because there wasn't that sense of embarrassment. They weren't frightened of saying to somebody else, I don't know, which is sometimes difficult to say in a professional arena, but they were, because they knew each other so well, but they were saying, we don't know. And the most common reason why they were doing things in a certain way was to quote, we've always done it like that. And it goes back to that earlier point I think I was saying, that it's kind of a habit, habitual. When you were at school, your teachers did it to you, you will now do it to your pupils and what have you. So I think we need to try and break that cycle. So I'm a big believer if we can get in with the initial stages and get some really good ground in there, but then continue that development through the CIA or I'm not anyone else. I'm not worried if someone else has got a good offer or better offer, then go for it. But we need to develop, because things do move and change in assessment. We'll learn new things, new approaches, and we need to pass those on and share them.
That's an interesting point, because I was just about to sort of move on to what you see as the role that technology can play in enhancing assessment or assessment practice. For example, what do you think to AI and the potential that it can bring?
Yeah, it's a very it's a question that's banging around quite a lot at the moment. Again, AI, not just in terms of education assessment, but in so many things in society. I think technology is kind of underused in assessment, and when it has been used, I think it hasn't been used well. It's been abused or not thought through. And I can give you some examples of this, if you like. I was responsible actually for signing off some years ago now to allow awarding bodies to mark papers on screen. Up to, when would this be, 2006, 2007, thereabouts. Everything was marked on paper at that point. So, the traditional thing, you'd fill in your answer book and off it'd go. And it could fly up and down the country in the post, several times to the awarding body, then out to examiners, then out to someone else to check, and all over the place. And scripts get lost or stolen or whatever else it might be. So one of the awarding bodies put in this idea of having on-screen marking, which now seems old hat, where the paper is fed through a machine and then it's scanned. And once you've scanned each question, you can then send, probably don't know all this, but you can then send all the question 8s to Philip and all the question 9s to Mick, and I can sit at home, do them all on screen. It's much quicker. And it saves, potential loss of paper. But even that caused some interesting reactions. And we did some reassurance on this, because we wanted to look at the impact of that. Do markers respond differently to something that's on screen as opposed to on paper, for example? We found there wasn't much difference, actually, because we did lots of stuff on that. So that was, in a way, it was kind of reassuring. In the other, I was slightly disappointed, because I thought we might get better results being on screen. Because what it allowed people to do was to focus on question 8 or question 9. I didn't have to worry about the rest of the paper. I could really focus on that one and the mark scheme for that one. But some of the markers were quite worrying, because we spent a lot of time talking to markers about their reaction to this. And they were saying things to me that I didn't particularly want to hear, but they were saying stuff like, well, I like to have a flick through the paper first to get a feel for the student, and I can get a real insight as to how that school teaches whatever it be. These English teachers, business studies, maths, you name it, they're all saying kind of similar things. I like to get a feel for the paper. And then there was this thing about, if I've been a little bit harsh on question 3, if I'm a bit of a dilemma on question 8, I might be a little bit more lenient on that to balance things out. And I'm thinking, no, just mark the question. It's not about balancing out leniency with severity. Mark the question to your best of your ability. So that bit kind of worked very well. But at the same time, we were trialling on-screen delivery of papers. And again, that threw up some interesting stuff. There was a technology, Key Stage 3 ICT, at the time was going to be a statutory test. We were designing that. We had some colleagues designing it so it could be administered on screen online. And it was some incredible technology behind it. It was basically what it did. It set up a machine as though it was on the internet, which it actually wasn't. Because what they wanted to do was to set tasks for kids to do, but they didn't want them to have access to the internet. Because we'll come on to the AI thing in a minute and potential cheating, etc. But they wanted to contain it within a world, as it were, but still for them to show their skills of how they search things, how they find things, etc. So it was like a false internet, if you like, cut off from the real internet. And it had some fantastic technology behind it to do that. But when I took it over in 2006, 7, something like that, one of the things I did, because I'm pragmatic, was to go out to see how was this working in schools, which I don't think many of my colleagues had worried about that bit. And that's when it started to fall apart a bit for me, because if you'd got one school I went to, 350 kids in year 9, which was the target group, for the school to administer that test, it meant that for 3 weeks to kind of take all the computer rooms out of general service, because they all had to be used for this 2-hour test or whatever it was. So you found that the head of maths or head of science said, "We're not having my computers because we need them for my A-level students," which is kind of reasonable. So some of the schools, it was essentially going to take us 6 weeks to go, to administer this test or longer. You then have issues about, some of those kids are now 2 months older than those other kids. So you get arguments about, well, they've learned more, or they've had feedback and all sorts of stuff. But one of the things that really struck me was talking to the kids who were brilliant, because they were saying that because of this technology, which I was saying was superb, which it was to me, to them it had lots of little trickwires, like function keys, for example, didn't work the same way in this environment as they did in Word or something like that. So you've got these kids, particularly the kids who were good at ICT, were fascinated by this. So rather than do the exam, they were messing about trying to work out function keys and where they could, produce shortcuts. So I'm coming a long way around to say that the technology must work in schools or centres. And one centre where we were trialling key skills on a separate trial was someone had this whiz idea that could put the key skills test onto screen. So what they did, in effect, was put a Word document up on screen. So the only innovation was really it was on screen rather than on paper. And then folk had to type the answer. But talking to some of these students who were doing that, most of them were apprentices. And one of the ones I went to, which always struck me, was near York. It was the motor trade, apprentice motor trade training association, whatever it was. And the idea was that if we could get it online, it meant that if you work in a garage in Lincolnshire somewhere, Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, you could sit in the back of the garage and do the test. You didn't have to travel to a centre up in York, which took you 2 hours or whatever to get to, or an exam centre. You could do it on the job. But what they were saying was that some of them still preferred paper, because that's what they spent most of the time doing, so they weren't very good at typing. Some loved it on screen because they did do a lot, they had good typing skills, etc. But what struck me most forcibly was that one of the tutors showed me they'd already got their own exam the example he showed me was building a carburettor. This was at a time when mechanics messed around with carburettors. I think it's all computerised now, but at that point it was important how you took the filters and things out. And what you could do is on screen, you could assemble this thing and then click a button and it would inject air and petrol. And you could get instant feedback whether it worked or not. Now that seemed pretty good to me. And there was an exam board who devised a similar thing where rather than have a sheet, the A4 sheet on the screen, this was geography. So rather than have a question about 2 wiggly lines to denote a river, and the question was I'm not a geographer, so forgive me, but the question was something like put an X where there's deposition and Y where there's erosion on this thing. So the first thing is some kids didn't see 2 wiggly lines as a river because there's a conceptual leap there straight away. Although they put some little bit tufts of grass at the side of it that didn't really look like tufts of grass to some people. Tufts of grass to some people. So what they did was they had a video clip of a stream. So, any child who has a problem with interpreting, because the first thing on that question on the old style was how do you interpret these 2 wiggly lines? To make a leap, so that represents a river. So you have this actual river. But that still hasn't taken off. So I think we should be thinking more about how we can do that, We've then got to put that alongside what can schools do practically. But then the advantages that we have, things like adaptive testing, for example. We spent years and years devising tests that were in tiers, so that in different levels. Because as you know, you can have, let's say someone's very capable in maths, they've got to answer all these very easy questions before they get to the difficult ones, and you kind of think, well, that's a bit of a waste of time. It's not telling us anything about that student. They need to go straight to the difficult ones, really, or the ones that are more challenging for them, or allow them to demonstrate their particular prowess. Now, again, with adaptive testing, as you know, it's kind of it's feeding off what the student does, so it can keep banking it up. But to do that, you then need good item banks developing, to sit in the background so that it can draw on those things. But it would provide the opportunity to do tests when ready. We trialled that some time back. Single level test and trial test when ready. This was through the DFE when I was advising on policy. And again, a great idea. So why do I have to wait till next July to do my exam? I'm ready now. It's November. Yeah. And there was a push for that at the time, and that push was coming interestingly from lots of adult education, where adults were doing like French classes on an evening or Spanish, and because they were adults and whatever, they didn't want to wait until June. They felt ready by Christmas, or some of them were remembered what they did at school and they were ready to be tested. So they were saying, why do I have to wait? Well, June, I'm going to a school to do it. I've got to register in a school. So you've got somebody who's 47-year-old sitting at the back of the room feeling a little bit uncomfortable, with all the kids looking at them thinking, God, you're struggling a bit, aren't you? 47-year-old doing your GCSE. But again, the issue around that was, this is going back to the classroom. If you've got some kids who are ready to do the test, say in November of year 11, and they do the test and they get the grades, whatever, what do you do next? Because you've got the other half of the class who are still working on the GCSE syllabus. So does it mean you've now got effectively two groups in your class? You've got an A-level group if you're going on to A-level. So you've got the practicalities of doing that. So whatever technology we come up with, we really need to look at the machines, the capability of schools. One of the enterprising awarding bodies, one of the directors, came up with a scheme. I still think he discovered or invented the iPad, because he came up with this idea that he priced this out. He got a technology company, I think in Japan somewhere, to work on this. They could put what we now call tablets. So every school would get 500 tablets that the awarding body would pay for. So all the kids would do the test on the tablet. At the end of the exam, the tablets would be pushed into a rack, something like when you go to a cafeteria and you put your tray back on. The second you pushed it in, it would dock and it would download, and off the I would say the paper, the test outcomes off they'd go, to exams and stuff. But again, the policy people were wary about that, which is interesting. That some people around the GCSE thought that there's scope for doing this. A different policy team who were responsible for tests, key stage 1, 2 and 3, were not at all comfortable with the idea of technology. It was the work of the devil to them. But then the issue around that was, again, the practicalities about kids need keyboarding skills. And I think it's interesting, in Finland now they've stopped teaching cursive writing. Which I think in the last 3 or 4 years they've stopped teaching it, because kids are using keyboards and things most of the time. So that's an interesting thing. If we do go down that line, do we stop teaching kids to write? Do we do everything on the keyboard? Because I think one of the things, and it strikes me forcibly, this, that I don't know about you, but if I was asked to write a paper on essay, my process and my own mental processing would be quite different to if I was writing that essay on a laptop. Because if I was using Word, I'd throw sentences in which I know I'd have to worry about. I could move them about, I could eliminate them. If it's a paper-based one, then you've got to kind of get everything in line and format. We used to do a little essay plan before you did an essay, and then try and stick to that. But on a laptop, I don't have to think quite like that. I can almost plan and move things about as I go through it. So I think the thinking processes are different. We need to think about that also. And then the last bit, and I'll pause for you to take a breath. AI. which again I think is really. Well, the opportunities are quite colossal, but the challenges are equally colossal. So we've got this whole notion. In fact, the university now, please, I'm on 2 working groups looking at the impact of AI on research, and another one looking at the impact of AI on teaching and learning. And some of the worries are, pretty obvious around basically cheating. Put in a nutshell, that if I set you an essay now, you can just go home, go on ChatGPT and say, write me an essay on X, and by some intelligent questioning from your point, you can kind of keep beefing it up. So I tried this with I don't know what. I always pick on geography, and I don't know why. But when ChatGPT came out, I asked it to write me a lesson plan on river capture, which I know very little about, but I've heard about. So write me a lesson plan for 8-year-olds on river capture. And the second I finished typing it, threw a lesson plan back to me, which looked pretty fit as a non-geographer. And I know these things hallucinate and what have you, but it looked pretty convincing to me. But I think you'd need a bit of nous to go away and check it. But it looked feasible. So then I said, this is great. Can you now give me some homework questions to set for this class? It did that. And then I thought, right, I'm going to test you now. Can you upscale it now to these now 15-year-olds who are about to take whatever? And again, it just filled it out. So if I'd have spent a lot, I could have gone up to degree level, I suppose, by filling this stuff in. So I can see the threat in terms of maladministration, cheating, however you want to describe it. But we've always had cheating. There's tons of examples of that, right from exam factories or whatever it is that we've got, or just asking a mate to go into the exam for you. If it's an institution where nobody knows anyone. In a classroom, it's quite different in a school because you get to know those 25, 30 kids. And I could always spot the minute that they'd ask mum or dad or parent or guardian to help with a bit of homework. So all of a sudden, they use different words or it was set out in a different way. You could kind of spot that. So I think it's a threat on that end. On the other side, it's quite a good way to process things. If you come across concepts you don't understand, for example, you've got a tutor potentially online. So I think we need to do an awful lot of work on this as to how we can balance the benefits and the threats. Equity becomes an issue also, which goes back to the point about using technology in schools. Did every child have access to the latest computer, for example, was an issue with that ICT test. Because some of them were working on computers that were 5, pushing 10 years old, compared to you go to another school down the road, they've got the latest version of whatever. And I think the same thing is starting to arise now, talking to students here about access, because some of these, as you'll know, ChatGPT 4 was open access or whatever, but you can upgrade by paying you $20 a month and getting a more advanced thing. So there's this thing about, can all students afford the £20 or $20? I think it is $20 a month. So if you are going to allow it, you've got to allow it, so everyone can access. So the university, if it bans one bit and allows another, we know that students with more money, more resource can go away and buy into these things. So I think there's equity issues as well as ethical issues. But I do like the idea of adaptive testing. I like the idea of using it, in gaming and things, in quizzes, in classrooms. Again, adaptive there, that's got fantastic uses, not just for the student, but for teachers. This is going back some years now, 6, 7 years. A teacher not too far away was using a quiz, but not just getting the results and kind of banging on. She'd set kids in little groups of 4 or 5 to do a quiz, which I thought was a kind of slightly odd approach, because you're thinking, well, there's going to be 1 or 2, they'll just sit back and let the bright spark do all the answers. When I observed it, it didn't work that way. There was dialogue. And when I spoke to her afterwards, because we sat down at the end, I asked her, what do you do with this stuff now? They've done the test, so what? She was brilliant. She'd worked out, these groups weren't kind of random. She'd worked out the dynamics, so there were certain people put together. Because she knew that somebody would have a bit of a bright spark and would do this, and so-and-so's quiet. So she kind of worked out who to put together. But what she did at the end of the day, she'd get one of these groups and they'd go through the test. And she'd say things like, you went for option 3, then multiple choice. Why? Why did you go for that? And then she'd delve into, what was you thinking behind that? Why did you just go for B, for example? Why didn't you go for that one? And the dialogue was so good and so rich. But it wasn't just, she didn't say, they've got 8 out of 10, let's move on. That was a really kind of, a deep deep dive into how they come to those things. So she could work out where when they got things wrong, where that misconception had really come from, and she could then work on that for the next lesson. So again, it was that thing about the purpose. It wasn't just a filler. It wasn't just a way for the teacher to get some kids out of the way in the corner to do a test and say 8 out of 10, yeah, that's good enough, we'll move on. She really delved into not just the outcome, but how they got to those outcomes. What was the reasoning behind them? And that was using multiple choice questions. So what looked like on the surface, is it A, B, C, D, or E? Much distracted did they go for? She used it in a much more, I thought, much more creative way, and way to find out what was going on underneath. So the possibilities of technology are limitless. But again, it comes back to can we resource it and can we keep up with it? Because the second you sign up for ChatGPT 22, 24 will be coming up, in another month, and you'll need another $20 or whatever it is. But I think we've got to grapple with it, and we've got to utilise it and use it in more creative ways.
So clearly, it sounds like there is a lot of potential for things like personalisation of assessment, and you mentioned about adaptive assessment, which is very interesting and clearly has a lot of advantages. But what I'm seeing or thinking is like this tension between the emphasis on standardization, as things are going, towards when it comes to education, and obviously like this emphasis or potential of personalization. How do the two things kind of like work together? On one hand, we're wanting to standardize the way in which teachers carry out certain types of assessment. So, for example, I've heard from ex-colleagues, how they formatively assess students in a classroom nowadays in terms of in part of their classroom practice. They're told that this is what you're supposed to be doing, to gauge the understanding or, to try to identify misconceptions. But on the other hand, we've got this idea of assessing students based on their abilities or their previous performance and things like that. Then how would you be able to do two things at the same time?
Yeah, you just made me think there that the two ways of looking at standardisation. The first, when you started asking the question, my first thought was in a technical sense. But how do we set a standard and then make sure that standard is applied to assessment? So this is, in essence, the chief examiner saying, if kids have been asked to make a cup, this is what a cup looks like. If it doesn't look like exactly like this cup, it isn't a cup, it's something else. So go away and apply that standard. Now that standard might be right, wrong, or indifferent, but that's what the answer is, the desired answer. Moderation then is simply making sure that all the other markers who are assessing these cups are applying exactly that standard. And I think that's one of the big problems we've got. One of the problems is, people mush together standardisation and moderation as though they're the same thing. Setting a standard is a key thing. This is what the answer should look like. And we know, as a chief examiner, you'd find this. You'd kind of put this is the ideal answer. If it's 2 and 2, it's not too problematic really. But if it's the causes of World War I, then it becomes more problematic. There's a few more. It's not just that Duke Ferdinand was assassinated. You might accept that from 9-year-olds, but if it was a PhD thesis on the start, what created World War I, you'd want something a little bit more expansive, I think. But someone sets the standard. This is what we accept as a right answer, for want of a better phrase. But we always found that, once you set the exam and the scripts come rolling in, kids are so creative and they see things that were never intended, but equally right. There's some ambiguity in the question that we haven't picked out. Now, key stage 1, 2, and then 3 tests in my day were all pre-tested. That doesn't happen with any other test I know of in this country, including universities or whatever. Sometimes they're pre-tested as much as someone churns out the same questions that they used last year or the year before. But by pre-testing, I'm talking about we would actually take the test out to kids. If they were 11-year-olds, the test had to be sat by 11-year-olds. It had to be sat at the same time as the real life test would be. Going back to my earlier point, that if you did it 6 months later, those kids are now 6 years, sorry, 6 months more advanced in the thinking potentially. So it had to be done at the same time, which was difficult to do because you were trying to find some kids who'd just done the real life test and then more or less saying, go and have a play out for 10 minutes and come back and do another one. And what the kids knew was that the new one that didn't really count. So there was a kind of the pre-test effect. That you knew it was done for, you weren't being assessed. It was someone trying the test out. So I don't really need to try so hard on that. But over time, you can kind of work that out. So the setting the standard, which I think is one thing. And I think if you're using multiple occasions, one of the beauties that we have, I suppose, and why people are so keen to do it this way is that if everyone does A-level English literature on June the 14th, every kid in the country is doing that same exam at the same time, for the same amount of time, etc. So you've got a standardised approach to that. It's the same time, same test. It's fair. You get into fairness. If it's an adaptive test, then it could be that kids are doing lots of different tests in effect. So there's a lot of science needs to go into that. And here the psychometricians at work here looking at how all these items, they need pre-testing, they need checking, so that before they go into the item bank, they've been through this process of checking, do they work, do they discriminate, do they give you the kind of intended outcome that you're looking for? There's any ambiguity in there, because kids are brilliant at spotting ambiguity. So what you'd have to do is to guarantee that the test you do on October the 12th is of the same demand as the one that you do on January the 14th. So that would need an awful lot more thinking and more working out and pre-testing, very carefully constructed item bank, and then you've got to look at what happens when you bring these items together. Because an item might work perfectly well there, but if you put it with these other items, it can have it's like putting a question paper together. You need to think about inclines and difficulty and all sorts of things. So that's one end of the standardisation. I think the other is what you said, which was interesting about the standardised approach and assessment for learning. And I think I'll try not to talk too long about this, because this is one of the things that kind of gets me going a little bit. That one of the problems with assessment for learning is that, in a nutshell, I think it's done very badly. This is my basic point. And by that I mean that, and in fact, it was during my research, one of my people I interviewed, she said this in a really interesting way. She said, looking in her school, she said one of the problems is that all the people learn the tricks of assessment for learning, but they don't understand what's going on underneath it.
Right.
And when I asked her to explain what she was talking about, and you see these various approaches, like holding red cards up if you don't understand it, a green card if you understand it, or traffic light systems, or all sorts of stuff. And like she said, all that happens is the teacher stands at the front and says, has everyone got that? All the green cards go up, because all the kids have worked out, if I hold my red card up, she's just going to come across and bother me for the next 10 minutes. So it's much easier to say green card. And at that point, the teacher will say, great, good job, let's move on to the next bit. When really, and she was a really good exponent to this, she didn't use that approach. She would ask questions, but then she'd dig deeper, ask people to explain that, or why did you do that? Not just, name the capital of a city, if somebody, throws out an answer. She'd kind of dig down into things and want to know, why they'd given that answer. You could have done this, why didn't you do that? Right. And that's the stuff that kind of digs into it. But the problem is the standardised approach. It goes back to the marking thing. People learn approaches or tricks that this school use. And although they set off in a good place with good intent, they've now, over time, been corrupted into a performance. And it becomes performance art, where people talk about assessment for learning. And then we get this thing about summative assessment bad, formative assessment good. Because summative is seen by teachers as that nasty beast from outside that puts my school into a performance table. It really should be about understanding kids' learning and stuff, which, it should, but you can use exactly the same test. And people don't get that. They talk about, it's a formative test as opposed to a summative test. Well, no, it's a test. The inferences you're taking are different, and the use to which you're applying it are different. But you can get, the exam boards are really good at this now, especially with the on-stream marking, as we were talking about earlier, the data they've got. at item level. So it's not just they can say how many kids got a C or a D or a level 4 in this. They can say how many kids did well on question 3B or whatever it might be. You can then do deeper analysis into what type of school they come from, all that kind of thing. Or if they did very well on 3B, how did that compare with question 8, which was doing it kind of a similar thing. Now, if you was a teacher, you could utilise that. When I was teaching a long time ago, one of the things I always used to look at was, when you could look at papers, was to analyse the items and say, what questions did the kids do well and which didn't they do too well on? Why was that? Now, sometimes it was because we designed the paper badly. It wasn't a really good question. Kids didn't understand it or whatever. But other times it was because we hadn't kind of marked it properly. But we didn't look into that depth. And when we did it across the department, we found that in this class, all the kids did great on question 8 in Mr. So-and-so's class, but all the kids in Miss So-and-so's did disastrously on question 8. What's going on there? And I think sometimes it's fairly obvious that whoever he did it really well, he teaches it well, she doesn't. Put those two together, and you'd often find if you talk to that teacher where the kids didn't do very well, teachers tend to be pretty honest creatures that say stuff. Well, yeah, I always have difficulty with that. Teaching that, I always find it. Well, put those two together. And then, how come you can do it so well? Because these are the same kids, basically, even though sometimes they were settled. So what's your trick? What's your secret? So again, you can use a GCSE paper in that sense to be formative. Not for those children who've done it because they've now legged it off to the sixth form, but for the teachers. But again, this comes right back to that thing, to the purpose that I used to set after the first test I ever set, which was Christmas of my first year. Head of the department said, Mick, I want 4 questions for the end of term paper. So I thought, God, what do I do with these? No, that was the first time I'd ever heard anyone talking about assessment setting exams. So even when I was trained as a teacher, nothing on assessment. So my go-to place was to get some old GCSE questions because they looked good. Pass them to Gordon. Gordon was collecting them from the other 6 teachers who taught that year group. They were all we all had them on bits of paper. We'd kind of written them out. They all went to Mrs. Kenyon up in the office and typed them all up into a paper without any real thought about, incline of difficulty. It was just those 4 followed by those 4, those 4. They were then run off on a bander, which people listening to this won't have a clue what a bander is, but it was an old medieval device for photocopied or reprinted papers that had some chemicals that people used to get high, so you get kids floating on the ceiling when the teacher was using it, and out the paper would go. So the first one that came back to me, I'm marking this paper over Christmas holiday thinking, these kids are a bit dim. And then starting to realise they're all dim in exactly the same way. They were coming back with the same answer. So I'm thinking, where did they get that mad idea from? And then you start to think, well, there's only one place, because these are the kids I taught. So that gone back to about misconceptions, that had come from me. So that from there on in, now and again, I used to set at the end of a lesson, I'd sometimes put a couple of questions on the board and say very clearly to the kids, I am not assessing you. I want to know if you get this right, because if you haven't, I need to go away and think about it. So just be honest, do your best, that sort of thing. I'm not going to leave you marks back. I'm not going to leave you any feedback. I'll tell you next lesson, what I think the right answer is. But that was for me, because it was a great way for me at the end of the lesson, when the kids had gone, just to think back and think, did I get those 2 main, if it's 2 concepts or something, whether it was river capture or erosion or deposition theories, geography, did they get that? So maybe a couple of quick questions. But I wasn't trying to rank them. I wasn't trying to test them about their knowledge. I mean, it's great if they came back and all got it right. I'm thinking, I did all right there. But if they didn't, and then this is the challenge for a teacher. I've got to find a way of getting that across to them. Because the way I've just done didn't seem to work for whatever reason. And it might be because, they had a bit of a headache that morning or they weren't switched on. But maybe it was just the way I taught it. Could I do it in a different way next time?
So based on what you're saying, because when it comes to the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment, I suppose one of the things that I usually think about is the purpose of which the assessment is set. And, like you said, the same test or the same question could be done for either of them.
Yeah.
So, but from what you just said there, I just thought to myself, maybe it's also about who's it for.
Yeah.
So if it's for the teacher,
yeah,
it's formative, and if it's for the students or to measure them, the focus is on them, it's more like the summative assessment.
Yeah.
Would that be right?
Yeah, again, being clear the purpose, and I was clear, and I think this is a kind of an ethical issue. When I put these things on the board, I was very clear with the kids. This is why I'm asking these questions. It's just like a lot of teachers at the end of the lesson anyway, don't ask a few questions just to see if they've got it. But the thing is, when you do that, as you know, you always get the same 3 or 4 put their hand up, or you can only ask 3 or 4. I wanted to know if all of them. And again, with stuff like whiteboards and other things, again, technology can help with, and maybe quizzes and stuff like that. If I can put that onto a quiz, onto the laptop or the tablet, I can get, clearer definition as to exactly who got it right, who did in pretty quick time. But yeah, it is a kind of again, it depends how you want to use these labels. It's kind of formative for me as a teacher. And informative for me as a teacher, because it's telling me have I been successful in doing this or not, and if not, what are you going to do about it? Because that's the key. Okay, some have got it right, fine. So where do you go next? That's good. The plan is to do this. 3 or 4 of them didn't get it right. So what do you do with those 3 or 4? Because that's important. Because especially in subjects where like mathematics, where these things tend to build on one another. So if they haven't got some of these basics right, they can't really move on to the next bit. And if the teacher does move on to the next bit, those kids are now in a really disadvantaged state. So for me, it was several purposes there, but being clear in my mind, this is not something I'm going to give you a grade on or a mark, because we know that, again, Dylan Williams and others have done stuff on this. If you give a mark of B and then you write 2 paragraphs, a lot of kids won't read past the B. That's fine, happy with that. Or 78 and some stuff. I'm happy with that. And I think it's on the summative, formative. It's worth looking at. Paul Black did some work on this about this thing about they're not 2 different forms. It can be the same test. It's just kind of a spectrum, and it can be the same test instrument. And people need to be a little bit clearer about what it is you're going to do with it. So if it is at end of course, and we want to pick the best 5 athletes over 100 metres, then we're going to pick the fastest 5. I don't have an issue with that. And probably a load of the people, the athletes, get that as well. But if it's really about what this child has achieved, then you might want to think of something that's not quite as blunt as a B or a 4. You might want something that's useful to the next teacher. And this is the thing I mentioned, if I may just right at the start when I said we're not very good at how we utilise these data, this information. One of the last things I did at QCDA, Qualification Curriculum Development Agency, before we closed, that was closed down, I took a bunch of staff to 4 different local authorities. But we wanted to look, I was interested about how we map, if you like, or follow a child through the education system. How do we utilise the information we get about that child to inform future teaching? So what I wanted to do, we called it Journey of a Child as a kind of a working title. If we'd have published it, which we didn't because it wasn't finished in time, we'd have given it probably a fancier title than that, I don't know. But the idea was to find a 4-year-old child and follow them right the way through their education up to 18. Now, obviously, we haven't got 14 years to spend on that, and you can't just wander around following children all over the place for all sorts of reasons. But so what we did, we'd go to an infant school, and we'd say, okay, at the end of when they leave the infant school and go to the juniors, where do most of them go to the juniors? Does that make sense? So we just kind of go where most kids went next. So we went to a school in the West Midlands, one of the schools, and it was an infant school. And they put together some information. So, when the child left the infant to go across to the juniors, which is on the same campus, the 2 head teachers' officers were literally, they could reach out the window and shake hands. But they weren't at the time, they were shaking throats, they'd fallen out. Not my problem, theirs. But this teacher put together this kind of pack of stuff. Now, we talked about workload earlier. It was beautifully done. It wasn't like a wheelbarrow full of stuff that you'd wheel into the next school and somebody'd look at that and think, oh God, it's going to take me months to read that. It was much more succinct and much more precise and much more targeted on individual children. And it wasn't saying, she tries very hard, or he's a grand little lad, or he's got issues at home, which are all, worth knowing. It was more nuanced than that, about that she struggles with her number work and given examples of that. So we went to the junior school, and we knew this stuff was sent on. So the question was, I sat there with a couple of my colleagues who were ready to take copious notes, and as we did on these exercises. So I just said to them, you get stuff presumably from the infant school. We were trying to make out we didn't quite know what it was, because that wasn't. And the head said, yeah, we do. I said, what do you do with it? And the head teacher looked me in the eye and said, we bin it. That was the phrase he used. That's why it's so easy to remember. We bin it. So I asked, literally, we put it in the bin. I said, kid, why? And this goes back to some of the other stuff about trust. So we can't trust that lot as far as we can throw them. It's all overinflated. And this is the thing that there isn't here about infant school, junior schools. So they progress measures measuring from key stage 1 to key stage 2. So there's a kind of political dimension, I suppose, behind this. But as crude as that was, and as cruel as that was, we got more or less the same answer everywhere we went. Not as blunt as that. Some dressed it up in all sorts of fancy stuff. But basically, no, they didn't look at it. And what strikes me is that we do work with children in a year group. At the end of the year, we've got this so-called summative stuff, where they get a report to parents. But underneath that, there's much more rich data that we know about. We know exactly where this child's struggling with their number work or their algebra. We should pass that on to the next teacher. The problem is there's a workload issue. I get that. But even within a school, I don't see that happen. Even from one class to the next. And my daughter-in-law, who works in a local authority not far from where we are sitting, she was moving from, I think she was a year 5 teacher, so they were having a swap over. She was going to year 6 this year. So she went to the teacher who she was swapping with. And Sarah, my daughter-in-law, who was an absolutely lovely lass, she just said, shall we just swap all our schemes of work and that stuff? And the other teacher said, no, I'm not swapping. So she said she's never understood to this day. They get on very well, they go, they socialise a bit to each other. But she's still suspicious about whether it was because she thought, why should I give it to you? I've worked hard on this. But then, so it's Sarah. It might have been, a bit embarrassment. Maybe it wasn't as full as it could be. We don't know. Or a bit untidy, or it doesn't really matter. But it's the same with the children. And Tony Staniff, who created the White Rose Maths, I did some work with him on mastery. He contacted me some years ago now to ask about what the hell's mastery all about. Anyway, he devised this, what became White Rose Maths. And one of the things that Tony said, amongst many things he said that fascinated me, was that looking at the way children progress through mathematics, he was given that class in year 10. That with a group of kids, that if they could move them from being a D to a C, this is GCSE, then the school would go up the local authority ranking. So, you target 10 kids or something, get them up from, which is all the wrong reason for doing anything. But what Tony said was, the problem for him was that all the stuff that the kids struggled with, he said, were things that he shouldn't have to be dealing with in year 10. It should have, some of it should have been dealt with when they were in year 3 or year 2. And those problems had been left, and they accumulate. Yeah. And his way of presenting it to me was, he said, it's like, and he stopped teaching statistics in year 9 because of it. Because he said, it's the equivalent of me standing up in front of a class and saying, this year we're going to do statistics. This is something else you won't understand. Because they haven't got the basic number work underneath it. So I think this whole idea about how we gather these bits of information, these data, how we pass them on to the next person, and how we utilise them to become more professional and joined up is a massive challenge for us. But I'd hate to think if my doctor made some notes to pass on to the next doctor, and the next doctor said, I'm not going to read them because I don't trust him, there'd be an outcry. Yeah, we don't use this. So it's going back to your formative, summative stuff. It purely is inference. It's how do you set a test, a quiz, a practical, something to jump over, something to jump under, to write about something, and on the back of that, as an educator, you draw inferences. And I think some people would say that's really where validity steps in. Is that a valid inference that you're making?
Mm.
So people talk about the validity of a test. I don't think there's such a thing as a valid or invalid test. It's how you use that test. I know validity means, is it testing what's on the can?
Mm.
So, if it is maths, then you wouldn't be putting questions in about river capture, for example, as an extreme example. But the validity about the inferences, can you substantiate those? Can you support that claim from the inference you take from the outcome of that particular assessment instrument?
Mm. So, based on what you just said, just kind of thinking what probably one of the last big points that I wanted to kind of cover with you, regarding things like consistency, inaccurate assessments, or practice based on misconceptions, which you have given examples for, and this last idea of valid inference. I guess the one thing I kind of want to see what your views are would be this idea of teachers having autonomy, being able to use their professional judgments or experience to kind of basically, do assessment in ways that they think would be appropriate, both in terms of the context as well as like their knowledge and understanding of what can work. And also this kind of more sort of prescribed way of making sure that everyone has the right approach that could have, perhaps not perfect, but would have a better chance of being able to capture things in a more accurate way. So the tension between the autonomy and prescription sort of narrative, I suppose, where do you put yourself?
Yeah, I get that. I think there's always a danger that if you teach in a class in a school, you form your own little world effectively. Mm. And I think one of the reasons I became a moderator many years ago, and again, I won't bore you with how I got to that, but one of the things I discovered very rapidly being a moderator was it meant I went into other schools and saw work that other people did. And that was such an eye-opener in terms of not just approaches and what content was taught, but also the standard. And when I looked at some of this stuff, and I thought, God, the work that these kids are producing is fantastic. And then I look at what my kids were presenting, and thinking, is my stuff as good as that? And then sometimes you try and make maybe a bit of an excuse. Oh, well, that was a grammar school in a leafy suburb kind of thing. They would do that, wouldn't they? Kind of. But sometimes some of these schools were no different whatsoever from mine, and sometimes far more challenging than mine in many respects. So in some ways, being able to look across what different teachers do, what different schools do, is really professionally eye-opening, because it kind of challenges some of your assumptions, some of your own subject knowledge, your own pedagogy, the quality of what you're teaching. So this is not just the assessment stuff. This is about, am I teaching the right stuff? How come these kids are performing so well in that compared to mine? And sometimes the other way around. I'm not saying that my stuff was all bad. Sometimes it kind of looked okay. But then there is the other bit about, I can take it back into my room, I can shut the door. This is back to the secret garden, the Ruskin College speech, where, teachers, it was almost that you close your door and it was your fiefdom or whatever, your king, you could do what you wanted. Mm. But you've got to work out at the end of a period of schooling in this country, children will do a standardised test, be it, Key Stage 2 or GCSE or A level or BTEC, whatever it is. So you must be aware of that as a goal, because there's kind of a moral dilemma there. I went to school in the Midlands some time back where it was in A level psychology. The results were pretty poor. This is in terms of the A's, B's, and C's, whatever. But everyone thought what a brilliant course it was. It was oversubscribed. All the kids loved it. It was fantastic, and we got someone to look at it, from the world of psychology, who said, this is far better than the A-level course. Mm-hmm. But the problem but you're teaching that, you're not teaching the A-level course. Mm-hmm. So although your psychology stuff is better, for want of a better description, it's not on the syllabus. See, this kind of moral dilemma about, I think I have a better way of doing it, it's more interesting. But at the end of the day, if we're putting our kids into that exam, I have to prepare them for that exam. So I think understanding the end goal. I mean, I can argue against it. I can argue that A-levels are the work of the devil, that kids shouldn't be doing it, etc. So, well, fine, that's a professional position you might want to take. But, can you stand in front of your students and say, I don't care about your A-level results. I'm going to teach you something more interesting, because those kids want those A-level results to get into their university. So you've a kind of a contractual obligation almost to do that. You've also, I think, to make sure that, within a year group, this was mentioned earlier about, the designing a paper across a year group, having that dialogue with your colleagues in the geography department or the history department, and working out the same stuff. My kids should get the same quality as the kids down the corridor, and vice versa. We should all be trying to teach, to the same quality and to the same depth. I know there are differences in sex, etc., but we should standardise that. This is why I've had a national curriculum. I mean, that's one of the results of the Ruskin College. It took some years to get to that point under a different government. But the idea behind that was that, as children move around, they would get the same deal. Now, this is what we're teaching in third year, in fourth year. So there is an attraction about standardisation, but there's an equal attraction as to have that professional integrity to go off script a little bit. If you can argue and demonstrate this is a way of getting to that end point. And the reason I say that, remember I mentioned earlier about the working group on marking and workload. One of the things that this group wanted to do was to in effect, my words are, I'm putting words into their report, or their collective minds a little bit, but just to illustrate, they more or less wanted to say they wanted to just ban written feedback, or certainly extensive written feedback, because of workload issues. Now, a lot of them came from primary schools, where I get that. I mean, there's one school I went to in the northeast where this year one teacher every night was writing a minimum half a page on the work of every child in the class. Some of them a page A4. And it was, when we kind of just mentioned, can these children read this? He said, no. So who are you writing this for? Who is the audience? And again, what the stuff she'd written was brilliant, but she spent God knows how many hours every night she was writing this stuff. When some of this working group was saying, you could read through the kids' work quickly and very quickly pick up, they didn't understand this point about river capture to flog that to the nth degree. So therefore, tomorrow I need to pick that up, or next time I teach these kids. So doing a kind of a collective thing, picking up the big misconceptions without having to go through all this stuff. So they were going to prescribe you shouldn't do extensive written feedback. So I think I was the first one I certainly was the first one to argue against it by saying, just hang on a minute, if I'm teaching some sixth formers and they've just submitted an essay, sometimes an extensive essay, I reserve the right to be able to write back to these kids with a personalised account, rather than say 9 out of 10 or well done, smiley face or something mad. I might want to just pick some key points and illustrate some points. So I want the right as a teacher to do that. It would be nice if my head of department or head of school said I don't have to do that every night. I get that. Because again, it comes back to the purpose. And they came up with this lovely mantra about it should all be, all marking should be motivational, meaningful and manageable. And I think those three M's are quite useful things, because if any assessment isn't manageable, it won't be done well anyway, because people rush it or not get through it. But I think back to your point, I want to know that we have, as a school, we do have a kind of an end goal, that we have an agreed understanding of the standard we expect. And that to me points, and I've done this work with NEHT on this about, I mentioned earlier about children should be fluent readers. I remember that, sitting with a load of primary teachers who were saying by this point, children should be fluent readers. And everyone going, oh, yeah, fine. And I'm thinking, these are 8, 9-year-olds. What do you mean by a fluent reader? What's in your heads now? What's spinning around in your head? And when they tried to explain it to me, it still didn't kind of work. But what did work, school in Featherstone School in the Midlands, the videos are available. I think they're probably still on their website somewhere. They did some little videos of children sitting with a teacher talking about things like genre. And the thing was like, children should understand something about genre, which everyone says, yeah, that so they should. But again, what does that look like? So what you've got there is a teacher with about 5, 6 children talking about genre, very skillful questioning by the teacher, and beautifully articulated by the children about, what do they mean by genre? How does this work in this particular? And they said, I've just been reading this particular book, and they talk about how that applied into that book, and then children would say things like, yeah, but I found it, when I compared it with so-and-so, this other author, and it was just, it's magic. And when you finish watching that video, it's only about 3-4 minutes, I come away with, I understand what they mean by that. Now, it might, if I took it to loads of different teachers, they might say that's nonsense, I don't know. But within that school, when they talk about, children should understand the meaning of genre, everyone in that school can see that, hear it, touch it, smell it. So I'm a big believer in not just having like grade descriptions, but actually having exemplars of what does that look like. So when I said earlier about, if you ask the child to design a cup, and then you can write about, you can write the cup should hold water, it should have a handle, and also, these are conceptual things that can be difficult to understand. Whereas if someone picks up and here is a cup, you can walk around it, you can handle it, you can talk about it. You can then disagree, it's not actually a cup. It's a mug or something. People will fall out over all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, somebody, again, back to your question, in that school where you're standardising things, I think somebody, it's almost like being a chief examiner, and whether that's the head of department, head of faculty, whatever, they have to listen to these debates about is it a cup or a mug or whatever, what other kind of vessel. But at the end of the day, someone's got to say, okay, I hear the debate, I hear the argument, but in this school, this is what a cup looks like, or this is what genre, what we mean by genre, this is what we mean by, someone who can read carefully, whatever it is. So I think that shared understanding is important. That shared standard, understanding standard in terms of performance is important. I think understanding what the outcome, the intended outcome, the aim is important. But I think underneath that, I want to back to that repertoire. I'd like to know there are different ways for me to measure some of these things that at that time are appropriate to me and the children. And they achieve what I want them to achieve. I know where I'm going with it, but just forgive me if it's like a football coach. If they all coached exactly the same way, life would be incredibly dull and boring as a footballer. You want them to get you to that standard where you can play for the Football League or an international. But creative coaches, the ones who do come up with slightly different things, are the ones that often stick. But the problem is that some of those things are idiosyncratic. I've tried, when I said going out moderating, I'm a thief. I will happily pinch ideas from any other teacher. I hope I'm honest enough to give credit where it's due. I'm not a total rogue. But I've also noticed that sometimes I've seen some of my colleagues teaching things. I thought, yeah, that's it. I go back into my room and it just doesn't work for me because I am not them. There's something magical about them that I haven't got. So not everything works. But then that comes back to, if it is an assessment instrument, if the results don't look like I'd intended them, I don't immediately assume it's the kids who have got it wrong. It might be me in my design of the assessment, the way I've put it together or what I'm about. So, yeah, there's an underlying flexibility that I want as a teacher, but that requires someone giving me that kind of repertoire. There are different ways of trying things. You can use a quiz, you can use hands up, it's all sorts of things. But understand their differences, understand their strengths, their shortcomings. But if you understand that, you can use them for what it is that you are trying to achieve, and then hopefully build it into the bigger picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. From your perspective, do we need to change our system?
I think we should constantly challenge it. Are you talking about the school system as opposed to the motorway?
The summative assessment system that we have established.
Yeah, there are various moves now around, like rethinking assessment, for example. There's a move where people are wanting to, well, I think the headlines, and I did write to kind of disagree with them a little bit. The headline was scrap the GCSE. So that was the kind of, the political dimension. And when you listen to their arguments, I understand what they're saying because of the limitations of such an instrument. And they want to do something which is more about a broader description of the child, of the achievements of the child. And there's another one called more than a test. That's more primary school orientated. It's basically saying kids, I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less saying they're more than a level, saying kids are level 4. There's more to a child than saying they're level 4 in whatever it is. I know that levels have gone now, but that's where it stemmed from. There's more to the child. I think the issue around some of that is that and this is because I'm old, I guess, now, and I don't mean it to be patronising, but I've seen these things attempted before. It's when I heard the Rethinking Assessment folk talking about what they put in as an alternative. It was what I call the National Record of Achievement that we had in the 80s, which became a great idea again at the time. It was trying to capture all the other wonderful things kids did. I mean, there was a sleeve to put in your GCSE certificates, but there was also lots of room to talk about what you did, in the classroom, what you created in art, what you did in outside of school, what you did in hobbies and all these kind of things. And they do give a much rounder picture of the pupil, the student, the child. But then at the end of it, there's a workload issue, gathering all that stuff. There's an issue about validating that. Is it the right standard? How does that apply? And then manageability, putting all that together. And will anybody read it? As I've said earlier, when those kids move from one class to the next, people don't read the last year's report, let alone a portfolio. So I'm not decrying that as that it shouldn't be used. Perhaps we can do it better this time. So I'm not saying don't do it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we ought to be constantly reviewing our system. The problem we've had, and I've been one of the guilty parties in this because of where I've worked, since we've had a national curriculum, about every 6 years, probably every 6 months, somebody's come up with the idea we need to redo geography or redo history or Key Stage 3 needs looking at. So we've constantly been messing about with it. And then we'd have a focus on Key Stage 3, quite reasonably, for good reason, because of what we're getting fed back. Something wasn't quite working. Absolutely right, modify it. But when we modified that, the second you modify Key Stage 3, all 6 months later, somebody said, hang on, that now means at Key Stage 4, this hasn't happened, or Key Stage still needs preparing. So we're constantly tinkering. And I think what we need is a body, which is what QCA was in essence, although there's always a danger you get dragged into the politics of this when you take a particular stance. It needs to be a body that stands above politics. It stands above any kind of political persuasion or hue or whatever, and takes the best from all of them, kind of eliminates the worst from all of them. But we should be constantly evolving. And we've got now, but it seems a very odd system to me, and I can see where it came from because of the national curriculum. We've got things called Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. We've got infant schools, primary schools, secondary schools, middle schools. And you kind of look at these things and think, well, what's going on here? What's really behind this? And I think we don't often look hard enough about the purpose of schooling. So when the GCSE, for example, when there was a debate with the Rethinking Assessment, they talk about we need to think more about assessment. Well, yes, I'd welcome that every day. I do a little bit of thinking about assessment, and the more people think about it, the better. But we have to put that into context about, what's the overall aim? What we're trying to do with it? Why do we say put kids into these buildings at the age of 4? And what do we expect of them when they pop out at 18? Is that still the way to do it? We talked about AI and all that kind of thing, homeschooling, some people, the impact of COVID. We know that's had some detrimental impact on students and teachers as well, I would argue. That doesn't seem to be mentioned much. But we have people who are homeschooled. We have the facility for people to be homeschooled. We have the facilities for schools to become kind of hybrid things, as we had during COVID. We had teachers teaching things online. We had some classes, which I saw where there's a teacher sat at the front with 15 kids and another 15 are online. Now, there's strengths and weaknesses in all of that. But I think it's a challenge to us. When schooling was set up some years ago now, it's still based on a kind of a medieval model, and you're looking at the kind of the way that we put kids into age groups and the way we now put them into these weird constructs called key stages. We should be constantly questioning that. We should be constantly questioning the content of what we do and the way we measure it. But I wouldn't go as far to say, therefore, we just kind of, was it either nearly it's like de-school society? We don't just, from next Wednesday, no one comes to school anymore because society just couldn't function, And a lot of it, I mean, that was interesting during COVID. It kind of illustrated the kind of, the social aspect of schooling. And I don't mean to socialise children, but the way it supports what happens elsewhere in society. Like parents, if they can't put the kids into school, they can't go to work, basically. So, the second you start tinkering with school and school hours and school holidays, you get an outcry from parents who have, the way they earn their money is dependent on a lot of that. And then we have that issue about, every time there's some outcry about, I don't know, drugs, knife crime or whatever, there's almost something immediately a Secretary of State or some leading politician or somebody will say, we need schools to do X, Y or Z. And schools are not the answer to everything. Education is broader. There's what happens with parents and other things. So I think, we should be constantly questioning the way that we do organise our schooling system. It doesn't mean to say we've got to be, radical in how we change things, but we should be looking for opportunities and different ways of doing things, like we mentioned with AI and other stuff. What opportunities does it create? But we've also always got then to look at the consequences, not just in terms of what schools can or can't do, but the broader society. Then, if you stop having, I don't know, if you get away with infant schools or kids don't start school while they're 7, like in Finland or somewhere, which some people would argue for, that would have massive implications for people who work. But then when people put that argument forward, when you dig deeper, I think just about every child in Finland attends a kindergarten type thing. So although compulsory school doesn't start while that age, every child is in an institution, education institution before that. So we've also got to be a little bit wary about all these arguments that are thrown at us. People cherry pick, in Finland they do this, or in Singapore they do that. Yeah, fine. It works there for good reason. There was I went to a conference in San Antonio in the States some years ago now, and we had people talking from Finland, Singapore and Australia about their approaches to, it was an approach to schooling effectively, well they call it education, they really talk about schooling. And there was a super bloke from Singapore who stood up and said something like, he was fascinated by the way, it was particularly around mathematics. All these people, the education tourists coming over to look at the way they teach maths in Singapore to bring it back to England. And I mean England, not UK, because there's differences there, but back to England. And he said, fascinated by it. And he said, one thing I'd recommend is, please don't just try and slavishly copy what we do, because it works in our culture. It won't necessarily work in your culture. And then the chap from Finland was the same message. And I remember going to I was still invited to the Finnish consulate in London every 2 or 3 years when PISA results come out. Because they always get some educationalists together, about 20, 30, just for the hell of it. I don't know why. And I don't know why they keep inviting me. But I remember last time I went, the Finnish ambassador stood up and he said, there's some good news and some bad news this year, in his introduction and welcome. He said, the bad news is Finland has actually moved down the PISA tables. Said, but the good news, and the only news that really matters, is we're still beating Sweden. And that was his whole thing. But again, this thing about free schools, whether the idea taken from Finland and in the States, they work in particular environments for particular reasons. And I remember some of the mathematicians coming over from Singapore talking about, they came to a school not far from where we're sitting, and said because the culture was so different. In Singapore, this is how they're explaining it to me, and forgive me if I've not got this right or it's just one instance, but they were saying that in Singapore you could get a child to come up to the whiteboard and they would have a go at an equation that didn't work, but they kind of go through it, work out why didn't it work, or if someone got the answer but in a different way, why didn't it? And if it was wrong, inverted commas, there was no stigma attached, there was no issue. These Singaporean teachers were saying, try that in this school in the north of England. That doesn't work. Children are frightened of coming out to the front because if there's something that doesn't work out, they're going to get some stick from the pals. There's a stigma. So that doesn't work it doesn't work in their schools in Singapore. There's no problem getting stuff wrong. But to get that attitude into our children, and that's like I discovered with IT in particular, that the kids were way ahead of me when I was teaching, and I learnt very quickly. Rather than make a fool of myself, I used to say to the kids, "Can you explain? Show us this, show us that," because they were brilliant at it. Far better than me. But I had the confidence, as opposed to hold my hands up and say, "I'm not the expert." And I think that comes back to something we perhaps haven't mentioned in the conversation, but it's there implicitly, that having good subject knowledge as a teachers is a kind of prerequisite for a lot of this stuff. When it's all right me saying, that teaching of algebra there didn't quite work, try another method. You really need some skill then, because if you're not very good yourself at algebra, then to find different ways of dealing with it is problematic. And I would probably the same in geography, history, wherever else. So this is why these things are so intertwined, that besides having good assessment knowledge and understanding, you need the pedagogical stuff, you need deep subject knowledge. And on that, my heart bleeds for colleagues in primary schools who have to teach history, geography, maths, science, what have you, will probably drop geography when they were 14 to study history or vice versa. And they have to work out, what does progress look like in this subject? How do I assess it? So I think there is a thing underneath this, that having good subject knowledge is also helpful. And it just comes back to this thing that assessment isn't out on a limb. It's just integrated with all this other pedagogical subject knowledge stuff.
Brilliant. So ideally, what would you like assessment to look like in 10 years' time?
That's a good one. I'd like to think that it comes from a base where the profession understand it better. So people understand its shortcomings, its strengths as well as its weaknesses. So I'd like a kind of a better knowledge base within the teaching profession. That's not how assessment might look, but that would probably influence what assessments take place. So better understanding of assessment, better knowledge of understanding, more expertise in assessment, so it could therefore be applied better. I'd definitely like to see more of a mixture, so that we're not totally reliant on testing and external tests, that we can be more appropriate. Because I think I've been all the way through this discussion that what is it you're trying to assess before deciding how best to do it. These are key things. So having that freedom to do it in the best way, not the only way. Put kids in a gym at the end of year 11 and let them do a written test. Now that isn't to say I'm anti-written tests. I am not. I believe in written tests. Standardised tests have a great place to play. They're very useful. They've got loads of strengths, but they don't assess everything that we need to know. We need to know other things, and some of them are better done through practicals, applied type assessments, as we find in the vocational field or in apprenticeships, for example. We can ask people to write about how to weld, but we want to see whether someone can they weld. So that can't be done through a written test. But if we've got that better knowledge, that better understanding, perhaps we can have a profession that can be trusted more. And I do stress, this is not because they're an untrusted bunch, it's not trustworthy. It's not that. They're totally trustworthy. The problem is that we just haven't instructed teachers. So every time I'm critical of teachers' assessment, I always add that second sentence. This is not because they're not capable, they are. It's just we've never given them that instruction. So I would hope that in the future we've got a profession that is better geared to this. And this is not just within main school education, this is within vocational and others, where they do, you think of surgeons doing, as I said, I've been involved in our College of Surgeons, when you look at what they do, they have a complete mixture of approaches. They've got multiple choice for certain things. The School of Dentistry, they've got there lots of multiple choice things, which are fine. There's a tremendous skill in writing those. They're incredibly difficult to put together to make them good. But they don't rely on multiple choice tests to see whether someone can extract a tooth or put a filling in or an operation. They have what they call OSCEs, where they have observational assessments, where they've got, I'm sure people are aware of this, where they've got actors sat in hospital beds, and they've got a pain somewhere around here. and then the doctor's got to the student doctor or whatever's got to kind of work out what it is, where it is. And this, remember I said my wife was American, there's a wonderful thing, I'm not sure it's still there now, but on the Mid-Yorkshire Health Authority website, they used to have Yorkshire for physicians. And on that, they had a list of phrases that the doctors might come across in their surgery in West Yorkshire. So there were phrases like, "Doctor, my shoulder's giving me some jip." And then they'd be able to kind of explain what that meant. But this was a kind of, if you're trying to assess that sort of patient engagement or bedside manner, you need an assessment that's not a paper-based thing. But we need to get education into a place where we can have trust in that. And maybe think about some of these other things that we do value, that we try to assess. And there are some real challenges in that, because one of the problems with the rethinking assessment approach, many strengths, and I'm not undermining what they're trying to do, but one of the things that I think they had a webinar thing or a podcast or whatever about this, that one of the schools was saying, to stop doing the GCSE and do our own local exams and include things like problem solving, teamwork, creativity. Sounds great. They're calling these 21st, 22nd century skills. Because as you know, we're teaching kids now we're going to go beyond this century. So we haven't a clue what's out there. Not a clue. But trying to teach those things. But again, it came back to the same issue that, what's the conceptual knowledge in that? What's the construct? What is it you're assessing? How do you assess creativity? How do you assess problem solving? You're back to square one, in effect. You've still got the same issues. Yeah. And how do you make sure that school, as well intended as they are, if they get at the end of it, a child comes out with, let's say, an X in problem solving, and I'm an employer in the Midlands, so I've got a child from their school who's from the south of England, I've got a child or a young person from the north of England, they both rock up with a certificate in problem solving, they've both got grade X. How can I be assured as a end user, that certificate, those X's were the same? And that was one of the issues around when the GCE was created. Schools started, or local authorities started to create leaving certificates to fill that void, because otherwise kids were leaving school with literally nothing, just left school. You'd have a report, obviously, from your teacher about, Trizard or whatever, and this is what they got in religious studies exams or whatever. But they tried to put something together to give the next phase some information. Again, this is one of the use of assessment. But then you get issues about what does that mean in terms of standard? If you're taught in Huddersfield, how does that compare with if you're taught in Grimsby or somewhere? Is that the same standard? Yeah. So then we got the CSE, which kind of brought that together. But much of that was about teacher assessment. And it was kind of trusted, but then over time that trust has broken down. But as a young teacher, I had to go to things like standardisation meetings. I had to go to moderation. And the first one I ever went to it's called, what they call standardising. It was a standardising. And people used to go, and up in the hundreds, it's all the schools would go together. And they talk about, if we set this exam, what do we want the outcome to look like? So you've got hundreds of people arguing the tops. I want it to be this, I want it to be that. It was just like, trying to control a riot, basically, of people with really fundamental, differences in terms of what they thought good was. Again, none of it for evil. It just had very different ideas. So it then went to what they call grade recognition, which was that, back to the cup thing again. It was somebody at the front would stand up and say, in effect, I don't care what any of you think, that's what a cup looks like. So apply that standard back, because that was a way of just bringing it together. But we don't have that kind of stuff now where teachers get that chance to come together. We don't train them initially. We don't make sure there's that ongoing stuff. They haven't got the involvement in the exams. And then we measure them by performance tables, the value added in the EBAC or progress out or whatever, and on, if it's point naught something, the school plus, the school's doing fine. If it's minus something, the school isn't. So then you will get people gaming the system and doing all these things. So I hope all of that stuff is, we come to it in a mature way, and we start to build a profession that is acts as a profession and is accepted as a profession.
Okay, so what recommendations would you give practitioners in terms of upskilling themselves in assessment, what should they check out?
Well, this is where I probably have to acknowledge my, partisan or declare interest, I suppose, in that. There aren't that many places to. If you're already teaching and you want to kind of upskill yourself, then I would clearly just point people at the Chartered Institute of Education Assessors, where you can do courses. There's a course at the moment that's been designed with the and promoted within the National Association of Ed Teachers, it's called a Lead Assessor course. And that's designed for people who in any school, well, there's now a course for secondary, primary, there's one just about, I think it's ready now for tertiary and vocational, and there's an early years one in development. Because obviously, although the underlying principles are the same, about validity, reliability, all that stuff, the context is different, so that needs to be understood. But those courses are there. They were proposed by the NEHT as part of their policy to upskill. Going back to the previous question, really, they were basically arguing that if they want to convince ministers that there are different ways of doing assessment, they've got to kind of demonstrate it. They can't just say, trust us. They've got to demonstrate capability. So the idea was to have this kind of lead assessor qualification and award, because people like awards, even teachers like certificates and badges. It started off during COVID, oddly enough, when Northern Ireland, because of the teacher assessed grades, centre assessed grades and teacher assessed grades, the concern was that people would go off and do all these various things without somehow coming together. So the Northern Ireland asked CIA to put a course together, and I think it's 250 secondary schools in Northern Ireland, all of them put 2 people in, which is a good thing in itself, because having 2 people, you get support in your own institution, and you get a little bit of challenge and that kind of thing. So 250 schools all did it, plus about 30, no, more than that, about 60 people, something like that, from the exam board there. And they just went through some of these basic things like, what do we mean by validity? What do we mean by standardisation and moderation? And how do we set standards? And that was hugely successful. And as much as anything, because it was online, which a lot of these things are now with the CIA, but there's a facility to have an inaugural meeting where somebody introduces the course or what have you. You can then do all the units online in your own time. But in between, there are sessions that you can turn up to if you want. If you don't, you don't. But if you turn up, you can discuss things that you just read in the unit or did in the unit. Either to say that's mad or I didn't understand it. But what was coming out nicely with Northern Ireland, people were saying, yeah, that was good, but I tried it in my school and it didn't work. And then you'd immediately say, someone said, well, it was okay with us, but then they say, well, why? So how did you do it? And then you got this cross-fertilisation. So that had great power, because these were not, lecturers somewhere or academics. These were people who applied these things, because much of it is applied. So there are courses there that then lead on to certificate, diploma and chartered status. Now, again, if any colleague can find courses elsewhere, to those, I'm not, there are others. I chair the advisory group for evidence-based education based up in Sunderland. There's some fantastic people there who are doing a great teacher toolkit, which again I'd highly recommend to people to look at. And they do have courses for assessment. But I think that's the only way we can start to build up that knowledge. And these courses that the CIA are doing, because they're running in in blocks in terms of time, you're getting people from different schools coming together to share and contrast. So, we were saying earlier, it's not just what happens in my school. I can listen to what the school down the road or at the other end of the country are doing in this. And I can either pinch that idea or think, no way am I going to find that. It works in both directions. But we do need to upskill, and we've got to demonstrate that. Because it's no use of just saying to ministers of any persuasion, trust us, we can do it. We need to build up that evidence that we can. And this will probably take, this NEHT thing, I reckon 4 to 5 years to build up this kind of body of knowledge, and then to be able to go back. In fact, one of our students here at the University of Leeds is looking at the impact of what impact chartered assessors have had on schools. We need to pick up the evidence base. So look, if you do these courses, this is the impact. It does improve. Or indeed it might not. We've got to be open about that. If it's misunderstood, misused, or it's just not good enough, then we need to go away and think about it. But certainly all the anecdotal evidence that's coming in is very much that by doing that course, it's enlightening people as to what some of these terms mean, because people use them incorrectly, or that misunderstanding. It gives them an insight into the kind of data that is useful, dodgy data, wrong data, all these kind of things. And for me, what's right at the bottom is at heart, I'm still in my head, I'm still a teacher, because the bottom line for all of this, it's not about getting better A levels or BTECs. If we can get this stuff right, we get better teaching and learning, and that impacts potentially every kid in the country. And that's where I want to see that's the real prize in this. That you've got teachers who, because they understand assessment better, their teaching is better, therefore the learning is better, and that touches every kid. And that's what I'd like to see, in 10 years' time, putting that support for teachers, that professional development, and the certification. And I think that the last thing I'd add about the chartered thing, why I like that so much, is that it's not a batch for life. If you get your certificate, you've got your certificate. If you get your diploma, you've got your diploma, and you can stop at either one of those points. But if you go for chartered status, you have to show how you apply that into your institution. Like I said, there's people done this in the RAF, in surgical places and schools and other places. All interesting, because a lot of it is how you manage people as well as the test instruments. But you've got to renew that. So it's not every couple of years. Well, I think every year you've got to put together your personal development thing to show that you're still involved and that you're still developing. It's not an onerous task. You have to fill a briefcase or anything. But you might be called upon at random, if it's 10% or something a year, where someone will say, all right, let's just have a little chat about this, just to demonstrate that you are still a practitioner, that you are still keeping up to date, and that you're developing your practice. So it's not like, I got my degree 30 years ago. The world's moved on. As a chartered person, you kind of not just moving with it, you're influencing that move. So I think those are kind of, and I am biased. I have got to declare that bias, but I'm biased because I think it's the right thing to do. And there's no personal gain. There's not. It's a charity. There's no profit. Yeah. It's just for the benefit of kids at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's such an important topic. In terms of like the reach you can have through better assessment or more accurate assessment. If I want to define what better means, but it's been absolutely amazing talking to you about this, and really value the time that you've, obviously given me to ask you these very interesting questions that can hopefully in many ways make a difference, to a lot of practitioners out there. The last thing I wanted to ask you, if I may ask you to sum up in one sentence, should we trust our teachers to assess?
Tomorrow, not quite. In the future, yes, we've got to do. Because if we can't trust our teachers, who can we trust?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mick.
My pleasure. Thank you.